Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm not a statistician by trade, so all those jokes kind of went over my head, but nonetheless. So first of all, I'd like to thank the guys at Agile New Zealand just for inviting me to and have this opportunity to talk to you. I think the topic that I'm about to talk to you about is very interesting and very critical to us as Agile professionals, something that we really need to understand to help us move into the next phase of our business cycles. So just sit back and relax. I've been told that all of this is being recorded, so don't worry about notes too much. You can always just refer back. The presentation, if you look, I'm not sure how good your eyesight is. I mean, in retrospect, this is probably a bad idea. But on the bottom right-hand corner, there is a page number there. So all you need to do is when you're taking notes, just make note of the page number, and then if you go back to the video, you can go exactly to the point of the interesting stuff that I'm going to hopefully talk to you about. So that's a little bit of design thinking coming through. So to begin with, this is Westpac's Stadium in Wellington, the home of the current Super Rugby champions. I've been waiting for 20 years to say that, so it's fantastic. I finally get an opportunity to say that. So let's start with a little exercise, right? So imagine that it's 1 p.m. I know currently it's not 1 p.m., it's 3, but just bear with me. And you're sitting at the top of the stadium, right? So we've got you the best seats in the house. It's sitting on the very top. And to make it relatively interesting, the whole stadium is watertight. So that means water can't escape from the cake tin. Now, imagine a drop of water lands in the middle of the field on the first minute, and then the second minute, the number of water drop doubles. So first minute, there's 1 drop of water. The second minute, there will be 2. The third minute, there'll be 4, and so forth. So I'm going to ask a very quick question to you, and I want you to think about it for a second. How long do you think you have to wait until the whole stadium is filled up with water? Now just think about that for a couple of seconds. So are we talking in the context of hours? Are we talking in the context of days? Are we talking in context of weeks? Are we talking in months? Well, I can tell you right now, it will take about 49 minutes, right? So most people wouldn't have anticipated 49 minutes, unless you've seen this exercise before, then, well, you've heard it again. And the second question that I want to, also ask you is, how long do you think it's going to take for the whole stadium to be 93% full? I mean, empty. So that means 7% full. And the answer to that is 45 minutes. So from where you're standing, sitting at the very top of the stadium, you're going to think that there's a whole lot of time left, because in 45 minutes' time, it's only filled up to 7% of the stadium. But you didn't know that in 4 minutes' time, it's going to hit the very top. So this is an example of an exponential function. And what I'm going to talk to you today is about the difference between an exponential function and a linear function, right? Just bear with me for a sec, right? It's not just about the function, but the impacts of technology that's showing these type of changes. So the first curve that you can see at the very top that's in red, that is an exponential curve, right? And us humans are very bad at estimating the impact of exponential functions. So what an exponential function is that over time, it gradually gets, the rate of change gets quicker and quicker and quicker as the time increases, all right? When we're talking about a linear function, which is the one that's sitting underneath that, it's a consistent rate of change. So we are really good at estimating what those things are, because the change variable is very consistent. So why am I showing you this? Well, let me introduce you to Moore's law, right? So some of you may have seen this before. To others, hey, it's new. Gordon Moore, he was one of the co-founders of Intel, right? So the company that makes all the CPUs and the computer chips for your computers. And during the early parts of his career, he noticed something very, very interesting, which is the number of transistors that happens to be present in circuits from when he constructed Intel doubled every single year. And then after that, a futurist by the name of Ray Kurzweil, he took an adaptation to that particular trend that Gordon noticed. And he plotted this function, which you can see right here, which is the number of calculations that you can do per $1,000. Right? So if you think in terms of $1,000 worth of hardware that you can get, how many calculations per second you can get with that hardware. So in layman's terms, if you look at this graph, what it represents is that the computer power that's available to us is getting more powerful, but on top of that, it's also getting cheaper. So we can do more things with technology than what we can do with it previously. Now, Ray's book was published in 2005, so you might be noticed for those people that are actually paying attention to what I'm saying and not asleep, is that it stops, in terms of the data points, it stops at the year 2000. That's because this book was published in 2005. But just to prove that the trend is still consistent, this is currently where we are, right? And because I'm from stats, here are the numbers, all right? I'm not a statistician, I assure you. I come from a psychology and an IT background, but there's the math behind it. I did get someone at Stats to verify it, right? So if you go to that link along the top, I mean, you can look at this after the presentation, but if you've got a link at the very top, it gives you an example of a piece of hardware back in 2015, and it gives you the basic cost per gigaflop. So gigaflop means there's a million, I think it's a million computations that you get, and if you multiply that by the number of, by 12,500, it gives you 1,000. So it gives you 12 trillion calculations that you can make per second, right? And that was in 2015. And what I can tell you now is that if you've got an iPhone 6 in your hand right now, or if you've got a Samsung Galaxy 7, if it hasn't exploded yet, kidding, that it gives you the same equivalent computing power that you currently have on your mobile device, right? So what does all of this mean? Well, Kayla's going to be presenting more detail about this after my talk, but I'm going to give you one specific example, so more of a deep dive into exponential technology and what it means. So if you look at our modern lifestyle, a lot of it revolves around technology. So if you start looking at something like communications, and how we communicate to our friends and families using things like social media, or just using some basic things like texting and phone calls, they all use data and they use technology. And for the newer ways of communicating, using things like Periscope and Instagram and blah, 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 blah. And then you look at how we get from place A to place B, right? So you've got things like maps that are available to us digitally, right? So no one carries a map in their car anymore. Or you have, what do you call it? Navigation through voice that is also available to you. Then you look at things like healthcare and how they can do tests in terms of checking how your health is, and how technology has really revolutionized some of the things that we're seeing in that sector. To payments. So you've got FPOS, credit cards, and the newer technology surrounding Bitcoins. They all, again, leverage off technology. Things like food production. So our current supply chain model of the just-in-time model really heavily requires the analytic numbers that comes from where certain products are in the supply chain and where they are to make sure that they are on the supermarket shelf by the time that you need them. And just general meetings that you're having at work, where you're talking to your colleagues and you're having your meetings, and they use a lot of the microprocessing, the word processing tools, and also things like Trello. All of those involve technology of some sort. So as technology is getting cheaper and more powerful, it means that we can leverage a lot more of the computation power that we're seeing from the hardware changes that we're seeing with the advancement in the computing space. So it means that there's a lot more capacity and a lot more capability in terms of the things that we design in this area. So one of the areas that I'm going to look into specifically in detail is that surrounding energy and the impact of transportation. So this is Tony Seba. He wrote this book back in 2014, so it's not that far ago. It's called Clean Disruption of Energy and Transportation, right? And in his book, if you just look at that headline that's there, it says specifically how Silicon Valley will make oil, nuclear, natural gas, coal, electric utilities, and conventional, what's the word there? Cars, thank you. Eyesight's a little bit terrible. Obsolete by 2030. Now, you might be thinking that is close to 13 years away. We're at the end of 2016. That's a very ambitious goal, but I'm going to show you some graphs and some data points to show you that that actually is something that is really, really realistic. So let's start with this. This is the price history of silicon photovoltaic cells in US dollars per watt. So if you look back at the beginning of the graph, back in 1977, you could see that to make a solar cell to generate 1 watt of electricity, it costs $76, right? But because of the computing power that's been available to help assist in the manufacturing and development of that, we're down to 30 cents. Then we look at this next very, very busy graph. Now, I don't really need you to look at any of the specific details. What I want you just to focus on is the general trend that this graph is showing. So if you look at the very bottom, right, it's showing somewhat of an exponential curve towards the very end here. And what this graph is showing is the different current energy generation techniques out of solar power and the efficiency levels that you're getting. So what it means is when the radiation comes from the sun and it shines on the panel, the percentage of the energy that it gets from that is converted into electricity. And you can see that it's getting more and more efficient, just especially over the past 5 years. So what does all those two particular graphs mean? Well, if your infrastructure in terms of the solar panels that you're getting is getting relatively cheaper and cheaper, and then the rate of efficiency that we're getting from the generation is improving drastically, what you're going to find is that the cost of energy in general is going to dramatically decrease as well. So if you look at this graph, it shows you the cost per kilowatt hour generation that's been agreed in terms of big contracts with some large solar companies around the world. Now, if you look at the one at the very end here for 2016, the United Arab Emirates just basically signed a deal just recently to generate a kilowatt hour of energy for 2.41 cents. Now, that might not mean anything to you, but if you compare that against all the other forms of energy that we currently have available, so things like gas, coal, to petroleum and all the fossil fuel options, most of them cannot compete with that price. As a matter of fact, it's really difficult to even compete with that type of price point at the moment, right? So once you've generated really, really cheap energy, what does that mean? Well, let me show you this next graph, right? And a lot of this is based on Tony Seba's book. So if you want to go to Amazon.com and order it, I'll give you an affiliate link afterwards. I'm just kidding. Man, tough crowd. No one's laughing at my jokes. That must be terrible. So this is a graph that shows you the projections for storage of electricity using lithium-ion batteries, right? And that is also drastically reducing over a period of time. Now, for those that are very interested in what Elon Musk is doing in this area, so recently, I think about a month ago, he announced Powerwall 2, right? And that was selling in retail in the United States for $5,500. And what it enables you to have is 14 kilowatts worth of electricity, which doesn't exactly plot on this line to the nth degree, but it's very, very close. And if you continue to follow this trend, and again, Tony wrote this book back in 2014, and the graph itself actually extended further back in a couple of early iterations of that book. But if it follows that trend being 2 years out, then if you continue to follow it, you can see that the cost of battery generation is going to decrease immensely. So you've got the whole energy generation component, right? So what is the impact on electric vehicles? So what it means is that when you have electricity at such a cheap price point, if you compare the alternative to what we currently have in terms of our internal combustion engines versus electric vehicles, this is one of the biggest differences between the two. If you look at the internal combustion vehicle, it has 2,000 moving parts, right? While if you look at the electric vehicle, it has only 18. So if you look at it from a cost standpoint, it's quite a lot of disruption in terms of the impact on your supply chain. So number one, you don't have to source 2,000 parts, right? You only have to source 18. So if you're talking about the manufacturing that's required to do that, it's going to be significantly cheaper, right? Secondly, from a maintenance standpoint, if you're paying your mechanic to go through 2,000 parts to see what the problem is, he's going to charge you an arm and a leg. While if there's only 18 parts in there, there's only 18 things that he can look at. So in terms of maintenance costs, it's a lot lower. So then we look at the relative cost at the moment for petroleum cars. So this is the average US cost for cars that run on petrol. And it's currently reaching a price point where it's completely comparable with it, right? So if you look at the average gas car in the middle, which costs us 31,000 US dollars, if you look at the most recent Tesla Model 3, it's been highlighted and announced that it's going to cost $35,000. So from a cost standpoint, right, it's gradually getting cheaper and cheaper. So from a consumer standpoint, it doesn't make sense to purchase petroleum vehicles anymore when you've got all the data that suggests that A, energy is going to be significantly cheaper, and B, just the construction of these vehicles is going to be significantly less in terms of both maintenance and cost itself. So these are just the data points surrounding the energy and the vehicles themselves, and you can watch Tony's presentation on YouTube. He goes into a lot more detail. But so this is just the electric cars side of things, right? But some of the stuff has some really major impacts on some of the social issues that we have in New Zealand. So there's a lot of media attention in terms of the traffic congestion that we have in the country, right? Specifically in the main centres. So I live in Lower Hutt, so that's the second one from the bottom. It doesn't normally take me an hour to get to work, but that's relatively comparable to how long it takes me to get to work, right? And we've seen some major developments in terms of the highway infrastructure that we currently have to try and alleviate some of these issues. And I'm going to show you a little video from CGP Grey, a great YouTube video. I highly recommend that you subscribe to it, to talk to you about the current mindset that we have in terms of transportation and what some of this exponential technology means in terms of trying to problem solve these problems. Let me...
Stuck at an intersection, you always watch unfold the fundamental problem of traffic. On green, the first car accelerates, and then the next, and then the next, and then the next, and then you, only to catch the red. Had the cars accelerated simultaneously, you would have made it through. Coordination, not cars, is the problem, because we are monkey drivers with slow reaction times and short attention spans. Even if we tried, getting everyone to press the pedal on 3, 2, 1 now would be challenging. This discoordination limits how many cars can get through an intersection, and when one backs up to the next, that's when city-sized gridlock cascades happen, taking forever to clear. In general, more intersections equals more discoordination, which equals more traffic. This is the motive behind big highways. No intersections. Splits and merges, yes. Intersections, no. No stopping, no coordination problems, no traffic. Well, that's the theory anyway. Intersections outside of a highway will back up onto it, again, because human reaction times limit how many cars cars can escape the off-ramp when the light changes. But even without intersections, there would still be traffic on the highway. Traffic can just appear. Take a one-lane highway with happy cars flowing until a chicken crosses the road. The driver who sees it brakes a little, the driver behind him doesn't notice immediately and brakes a little harder than necessary. The driver behind him does the same until someone comes to a complete stop. And oh look, cars approaching at highway speeds must now stop as well. Though the chicken is long gone, it left a phantom intersection on the highway. This is what's happened when you're stuck in traffic for hours thinking there must be a deadly pile up ahead, and then suddenly the traffic's over with no wreckage in sight. To your relief if you're a good person and mild annoyance if you aren't. You just pass through a phantom intersection, the cause of which is long gone. And this phantom intersection moves. It's really a traffic snake slithering down the road, eating oncoming cars at one end and pooping them out the other. On a ring road, a single car slowing down will start an ouroboros of traffic that will last forever, even though there's no problem with the road. If the drivers could coordinate to accelerate and separate simultaneously, easy driving would return. But they can't, so traffic eternal. On highways, traffic snakes grow if cars are eated faster than excreted, and they shrink if excreted faster than eated, dying when the last car accelerates away before the next car must stop. Now, in multi-lane highways, there needs be no chicken to start gridlock. A driver crossing lanes quickly with cars too close behind is enough to birth a traffic snake that lives for hours and leagues. It's this quick crossing that causes drivers behind to overbrake and begin a chain reaction. But we can make traffic snakes less likely by changing the way we drive. Your goal as a driver is to stay the same distance from the car ahead as from the car behind at all times. Tailgating is trouble, not just because it makes accidents more likely, but because you as the tailgater can start a traffic snake if the driver ahead brakes. Always in the middle. This gives you the most time to prevent overbraking, but also gives the driver behind you the most time as well. And when stuck in traffic, this rule would get all cars to pull apart the snake faster. That's the simple solution to traffic, getting humans to change their behavior, perhaps by sharing this video to show how and why traffic happens, why tailgaters are trouble, and how we can work together to make the roads better for all. The end. Except, yeah, wishing upon a star that people are better than they are is a terrible solution every time. Instead, what works is a structurally systematized solution, which is exactly what self-driving cars are. Self-driving cars can just be programmed to stay in the middle and accelerate simultaneously. They'll just do it. The more self-driving cars at an intersection, the more efficient the intersection gets. A solid lane of self-driving cars vastly increases throughput. Actually, if you ban humans from the road, which we should totally do anyway, you can get rid of the intersection entirely. After all, a traffic light is just a tool for drivers on one road to communicate with drivers on another, poorly and coarsely. Red equals don't go now, we are coming through the intersection. Green equals good to go. But self-driving cars can talk to each other at the speed of light. With that kind of coordination, no traffic light necessary. Just as with a highway, the best intersection is no intersection. Humans will never drive this precisely. At the intersection, the fundamental problem with traffic that you watch unfold, as with everything, is people. So the real simple solution to traffic is no more monkeys driving cars.
So the reason why I showed you that is one of the byproducts of having electric vehicles is the ability for them to self-drive, right? So you would have seen a lot of studies around the world, well, not around the world, but some testing, especially around the States. And just recently, I think about a week ago, they started testing in Tauranga with the Volvo cars. So there's testing of it all around the world. And if we have all these fundamental issues of traffic that we currently have in New Zealand, and if you look at how the infrastructure in terms of our motorway and the current solutions to those problems that we have is the first part of that video. If you think more forward in terms of what other kind of solutions that we potentially have, especially around the problem of traffic, having electric vehicles and having the ability for them to self-drive really solves a lot of those problems. So what other problems can self-driving cars solve? So one of the other ones, a piece of research that came through from Australia was the amount of costs that's currently the country of Australia is burdened with in regards to the healthcare provided to people that happen to, unfortunately, be in a position of an accident. And the total amount of money that they predicted they can save is $27 billion. That's about 10% of New Zealand's GDP. Right? So there's a lot of cost that we currently pay for when it comes to the problems that we have associated with traffic. Another one. this is something that has been a very popularized problem that we've had in New Zealand for over the past 15 years. And it's talking about how we have this inability to afford housing because of the rate in which the cost of housing is. Well, if you think back to the whole notion of self-driving cars, the ability for you to get to from point A to point B is drastically reduced. Now, the sole reason why we all want to live closer to the city is typically because of the fact that we want to be closer to work so we don't have to spend so much time in traffic, which means that there's a heavy burden in terms of the demand that we have on housing that's close to the city. Now, very similar to what we saw after World War II, especially in the States, where we saw the growth of suburbs in the States. That was a byproduct of the vehicles being cheaper for the middle class folks in the States. And what that enabled them to do is live further away from the city because there's an avenue to get them from work and to work much shorter. Now, the current infrastructure that we have isn't really designed for the volume and the growth that we've seen over the past 50 years. So if we have a simple solution such as self-driving cars, which can get us from point A to point B a lot quicker, which means that we can then live further out from the city, which means there's less of an impact on the demand side when it comes to living closer to the city, but then also there's a lot more supply further out in the city. So if you can think living in Hamilton, right, we've got things like speed limits. Well, do speed limits really apply when you have self-driving cars? They don't, right? And the whole paradigm of what we see and what we view of transportation with roads that go one way and the other part of the road that goes the other, that's only a human construct that we've constructed to help us identify particular rules. But if it wasn't humans driving and if it was electric vehicles, then do we have that problem anymore? Probably don't. So that's something that can really drastically impact on another major issue that we have in New Zealand. So I can talk hours and hours on energy and self-driving cars. I look into it a lot. I think it's very, very interesting. But the purpose of showing you all of that is basically going back to this initial graph which I showed you, which is the difference between linear and exponential functions. Now, in terms of the impact of energy and some of the technological advancements that we've made in that space, and how I explained that most of our modern life surrounds or has some kind of tie-in with digital platforms or digital technologies, if this stuff is getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and also more powerful from that standpoint, and it's growing at an exponential rate, it means that the technology and the things that will come as a byproduct of that is going to come at a really, really rapid rate. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples of, well, actually, I'm not going to show you, I've already showed you a couple of examples, but what I wanted to show you is that we're currently here, and this is my opinion, on the exponential graph, where we haven't really noticed much change over the past 50 years, right? But as with exponential functions and our inability as humans to work out the impact of exponential functions, we're going to see a lot of rapid change in the next 5 to 10 years, right? And the question that I have is, are the businesses that we are in, or the businesses that we own, have we factored this in terms of our planning? So I'm going to show you another graph. Right? This is a graph that shows the different types of technology that's been around over the past 650 years, right? And you notice that there really wasn't an awful lot going on for the first 550 years, right? You've got man on the moon, but before that, there wasn't really a lot of things that really drastically impacted on our day-to-day lives. But then if you look at the last 50 years and the amount of things that has really come about that has large adoption from a humanity standpoint, we're seeing a lot more of those things, and a lot of those are leveraged off the technological capabilities. So I had the pleasure of going to the Singularity University Summit a couple of weeks back, and this is David Roberts. He's one of the faculty members of the Singularity University, and he said something that was really interesting to me, and I thought I'd repeat it, which was, innovation is doing the same things better. Disruption is doing new things that make old things obsolete. And I think most of the organizations that we work in, we think we work in that first part, right? Which is how we can do the same things better. But if you look at all the technology that's coming around and what the impact of that is, so if we take my example of energy into self-driving cars, into, well, not self-driving cars, but electric vehicles, if you compare that to, say, for instance, you're someone that works at Toyota, or someone that works in the automotive industry, or you're a mechanic, what type of disruption that means to your business model. It's not something that is an incremental change that you can go, right, well, they just made that combustion engine much faster, so I can focus a lot of my resources to make sure that we can compete on that level. But if the technology that's there is impacting and making it completely impossible for you to compete in every single part of the supply chain, what can you do about that? And that is the type of thing that's coming to us that we really need to plan for. So what do? We fight fire with fire. And for people that don't know what those things are, they're fire Pokemon. Shows my age. So one of the key advantages that small startups have over large organizations is their ability to do things at pace, at speed. And that's because they don't have any pre-existing process or governance or politics or technology stacks that they have to follow in terms of what they have to do. So it means that if they're going to validate a lot of their experiments and their assumptions that they're creating, it's a lot quicker than what large organizations have, which is the basis of this. And again, Jeff talked about it earlier, and a couple other speakers talked about this, which is the lean startup method, which follows this particular nice little circular diagram, which talks about build, measure, learn. And I've highlighted at the very top where it says minimize the total time it takes to go through the cycle, right? So the whole purpose of the whole lean startup process is that you're minimizing the time it takes for you to get that feedback. So if in order for you to compete with all this level of disruption, you have to do it at pace. And if you are a large organization, you have a large pre-existing processes in place, it makes it really difficult for you to compete not just on a one-to-one basis, but if there's multiple disruptions or multiple impact basis, it's really going to be really hard for you to compete against that. So this is something that we had to do at Stats, and I'm not going to actually talk about a Stats example because we're not actually that far ahead, but I know this is being recorded, so people that are watching in Stats, I'm sorry. But we had to take some of our staff out because we had some of those issues surrounding our technology and governance. So we're just kind of trialing this at the moment. But we're seeing some other examples of this from different parts of New Zealand, and at different scales. So you've got the hackathon for health that occurred earlier this year in conjunction with Victoria University that's looking at solving health issues over the course of a 2-day build, learn, measure cycle. Then you've got things like Hack Miramar, and then we've got larger ones such as GovHack, right, which is looking at public sector issues. So those are really quick timeframes and turnarounds over the course of 2 days in which you're doing the experiments on. And then you've got a slightly larger scale, and by larger scale I mean not from 2 days in terms of a weekend, but to 5 days. So this is the Google Design Sprint, which they pioneered back in 2011, right? Which again, they use different words, but it's about the same principle. Going out there to test and validate your assumptions as quick as possible. And then you've got larger scale accelerator programs, right? And very similar to what Jeff was talking about in the first keynote that he was demonstrating, we had that graph that showed the waste of time. So there's that perfect green line that goes in terms of your amount of testing and validity that you do to get the confidence level. So these large-scale programs are basically, if you can test those assumptions relatively early and they validate those assumptions, it's a mechanism to scale those assumptions and tests that you do. But if you look at the top one, that's Y Combinator. That's one of the most successful ones in the States. They had Airbnb go through that. And in terms of a local example, we've got the Lightning Lab, which again, someone showed earlier. And then from the public sector standpoint, there's the R9 Accelerator. And then you've also got internal acceleration programs that you're seeing in places like Spark Ventures or Fonterra with their Fonterra Activate program. And as a byproduct of doing these short tests and scaling them, you have some very successful case studies that you've seen in this area. So number one is Dropbox, right? So they originally adopted a lot of these methodologies early on just to see where the gaps are missing in terms of the market. And now the platform is valued at $10 billion. And they originally, again, came out of Y Combinator, right? So one of the accelerator programs that I showed you right in the beginning. And then you've got more local examples, such as Whipster, which was recently on the Sydney Morning Herald, I believe. They're talking about it's a video curation piece of software. That's really hitting quite a bit of traction in that space. And from the internal accelerator programs from Spark Ventures, you're seeing things like Curious and also Morepork, right? And they're completely different to their normal standard business models, but they're venturing into areas where they can get value and actually helps with their bottom line in terms of their business. So this gives you the framework, right? The second part that I'm really quickly going to talk about is keeping your companies educated with the emerging tech that's out there. So if you look at something like this, which is Open AI Gym, right, which basically educates you on the space of artificial intelligence, and an example of some of the things that you can do with that is teaching. You can go to the website to see the video on Pong, which basically teaches them how to train a machine to play Pong against each other, which is very, very fascinating. If you can apply that to something on that scale, then can you imagine what you can apply in terms of other parts of your business in which you can automate? Then you've got things like IBM's Watson or deep learning, to things like 3D printing and manufacturing. So the tech has really improved, and I think Kayla's going to talk about that in her presentation after mine. But some of the stuff that you hear on the news, it's about a year old. Some of the stuff that you're really seeing on the precipice of the guys that are doing this, it's really, really exciting what those things mean to your particular supply chains or things like manufacturing, and especially in the health space. To virtual reality. So, there's a HTC Vive there. I highly suggest that you go play with one of those just to see what the impact of, what the potential possibilities that you can get out of that. I mean, at the moment, you're looking at it and you think, oh, wow, this is kind of cool, right? But that's because it hasn't reached the computing power that means it's viable for you to use on a daily basis. But if, again, we're reaching this kind of exponential technology change, if those virtual reality headsets are very, very small, can you imagine having a meeting at home with other board members or whatever, or your team, without actually have to physically go to the office? People always complain about, well, it's nice to actually see what the emotions are. Well, if you can have technology that can capture all of that, what is the point of going to the office? So I want to give you an example. So Uber, right? Poster child of startup space, right? Now, what you might have heard is that Uber is testing self-driving cars, right? Now, what you might not know is that the reason why they've exploded in this space is because Elon Musk, in 2014, made the patents and all the technologies that he and Tesla have put together in the self-driving car space available open source. So anyone, and you can see companies like Volvo, BMW, grabbing a lot of the technology and the code that they've written in that space, and they've leveraged it. And then now they're looking into a completely different business model in which it wasn't what they looked into originally when they set up Uber, right? So this is an example of why you have to keep track of the technologies that are available and what the impact is. And it might not look like it's going to impact on your current business, but it may actually show you a different business opportunity that you wouldn't have seen previously. And then a last example here. It's another video. So if you think back to Google in terms of Translate, which they originally introduced back in 2006, since then they've made some massive, massive changes into that platform, right? So you've seen that there's been more languages being available. The accuracy of it has really improved. And you've got things like voice recognition. So this is an example of what someone has done, leveraging off that technology. I'm going to show you a quick video.
I came up with the idea for a translator when I met a French girl. Elodie, put this in your ear.
Je mets ça dans mon oreille,
Yeah, put it in your ear.
comme ça.
Yeah.
Ok.
Can you hear me in French?
Pouvez-vous me entendre en français?
Et je peux t'entendre parler français. Mais c'est
Yes,
génial.
I can hear you talk French.
Attends, comment ça se fait?
But this is awesome. But how you do it?
This little wearable uses translation technology to allow two people to speak different languages, but still clearly understand each other. It's the dream, you know? A life untethered, free of language barriers. It's just that it's no longer a dream anymore. It's real.
So it's a plug for these guys. But if you think about what the impact of that in terms of your current business model, all right? So currently your market are probably the only ones that speak English. But if language is no longer an issue, right? And the language problem is no longer there, and we have a universal way of communicating, from a business standpoint, that opens you up to 7 billion customers. And with that, I'll finish on that note. Thank you.